Hey, we're gonna finish this model. It's behind us. It's missing an end king cripple, which is a jack rafter that comes down right here. I don't have it drawn in this drawing, but one goes there, similar to this end king common. And then we're gonna put in this broken hip and this other broken hip it's missing. And you'll notice this broken hip stops just as this one does and starts again as a valley and drops down to the lower plate. And there's an 1.5 inch space in between because it goes into the ridge 3/4, comes out 3/4. 3/4 and 3/4, 1.5 inches. And that happens here, in here. And we want to get the length of this end king cripple first, which goes just like this one, like I said, from the end of this ridge to this jack. And if you can imagine that this valley was connected to this broken hip and went all the way down and landed on this plate here, like I swung a radius here from the center line of this ridge, then there would be a space in between this valley and this hip here. And the way we would figure out where that would land is to take 27, subtract it from 39, and then what we want to do, see if you'll notice the center line of this one, which is the same as this one's going to be, stops at the ridge right there, stops right at the ridge there. It's going to do the same here. So why does that matter? The reason that matters is we're not going to have to do a deduction on that side. We're only going to have to do a deduction on the other. And what I mean by a deduction is we are going to go from center line of this valley to center line of this valley. This would be a hip, technically a disappearing hip, and subtract half the thickness of this framing member because we die out on the outside of it. So if we're to center line, we subtract half the thickness. So let me do the math and I'll show you what I mean. 45 thickness of a 2x, this is a 2x4, this is 1 1/8, half of that's 1 1/16. So we're going to go 39 minus 27 minus 1 inch to get to the center line, and then 3/4 inch to get to the point where we start our saw so it'll come out at the center line. So minus 1.5 inches, minus 1 3/4 equals 10 1/4. That's our run. That's the run. And what we want to do is multiply it by the secant, which is written right here. Number 2, 1.536. And I have that on recall, so times recall 2 equals 15 3/4. So this one is 15 3/4 inch, right there. Now we're done with that. We want to calculate the length of this broken hip. How do we do that? Well, there's one way to do it is take this common rafter run, subtract this common rafter run, and then an additional 1.5 inches, because if you'll see, this common rafter terminates right here, but this one terminates right here and the broken hip terminates there. So we'd have to take this one and subtract an additional 1.5 inches. That's one way of doing it, but another way is to take the big span minus the little span of which the broken hip connects. So in this case, it's actually this big span minus this little span minus half the lower, divided in half, then minus half the thickness of the lower ridge and half the thickness of the upper ridge. And that'll give us the run, and then we multiply it by our hip valley secant, which is right here. That'll give us the broken hip length. So we'll do that right now. That run is 102 minus 24. So you have 102 here, minus 24 will get us out here. So 102 minus 24 equals, that's a 78 inch span, right? Minus 48 inches. Minus 48 inches, which is the little span, gives us 30 inches. Then we divide that in half. And now we have this run going this way. Now we subtract half the thickness from center to center of this upper and half the thickness of the lower. Both are 2x, so that's 1.5 inches minus 1.5. And our run is 13.5 between this side of this and this one. And then we multiply it by second secant, which is, in our case, recall 3 equals, 13.5 times recall 3 equals 24 3/4 is the length of that broken hip. From long point to long point of the double cheek, so 24 3/4. And then this one here, same thing. Big span minus little span divided in half. Once you divide it in half, last thing you do is subtract half the thickness of the upper and half the thickness of the lower ridge, and then multiply it by your secant. So let's do that. 66 minus 48 equals, times 0.5 or divided by 2 equals 9 inches, right? Minus half the thickness of the upper and half the thickness of the lower. So let's do that again, just for fun. 66 minus 48 equals 18 divided in half, so times 0.5, minus inch and a half, 7.5 inches is our run. And you know what I'm doing? Doing something wrong. This span minus this span. This broken hip breaks these, connects these. So bear with me. 102, that's cool that you see a mistake. 102 minus 24 equals 78, right? 78 inches minus 66. Minus 66 inches is 12 inches divided in half, right? Divided by 2, or I like to go times 0.5, it just makes more sense to me. That gives us 6 inches minus the 1.5 inches, 3/4 and 3/4, minus 1.5 equals a run of 4.5 inches, and then times recall 3, which is 1.833, times recall 3 equals, and that one is 8.25 inches. 8.25 inches. And we have all these cuts, so follow me and I'm going to install them in order. The first one is 15.8. Is our end king cripple, almost 16 inches. Usually nail the top first, you can get away with it. You have to battle a nail gun, because that's the mixture of nail guns, especially this one. Needs oil. Bring it on up. Bring it on up. Give me a minute. One more time. This time I'm feeling. There we go. Yeah. And then this one gets raised a 1/2 inch to plane into the center of the valley. That's that one. Broken hip, which is the longer of the two broken hips, remember? Big span minus this tiny span divided in half minus half this thickness of ridge, because it goes to center. It goes from center to center. So half this thickness of ridge, add a 90 to it, half this thickness of ridge. The remainder, or the product, the remainder is multiplied by the secant, or line length ratio, and it gives you the broken hip. And with the broken hip, you come down into that crux. Make sure this is over. That's really important. It doesn't sit tight. The other one. Install logs right here. See if it works better right here. Maybe. It goes down in the crux like that. So these lead edges line up. And then this one lines up over the top, which is almost where it's at actually. So right there. It cleans over the top. Yeah, right there. And then the last one is this little one that you heard falling on the floor. And that goes on the opposite side. Right there. Fires off like that. And then it does its own planing because it's so short. It's actually got to lose quite a bit of it. Oh, that's the sound of construction. There it is. And that plane's okay. Not too shabby. So there they are. Not too bad.